The Earth is suffering a
There
crisis
are
of mass
concerns that
extinction.
governments will reject more drastic measures to cut
Gases need
carbon
to peak
emissions.
within the next 3 years if we are to stave off the worst effects of climate change.
Wild plants and animals are running out of places to
UN
live.
scientists are warning we are on course for devastating changes to our climate, and the results will be
In
catastrophic.
what year will the human population grow too large for the Earth to sustain?
Climate change and global warming are accelerated by numerous factors. Fossil fuels, deforestation, overfishing, farming, power plants, waste management, oil drilling, transportation, industrialization, consumerism, etc. The list goes on and on. As natural resources are depleted and the planet reaches a point of no return, we have to make accommodations. We have to adapt. We not only have to change the way we live, but we have to change the way we fight. Green war is a theorized type of warfare, very possibly the next type of warfare, with countries, governments, and private entities fighting for limited natural resources as climate change rapidly changes our Earth. Listen in as national security experts give their point of view on a potentially looming future. This is Green War. Episode 3, An Uphill Battle.
I'm Alex Hall. I'm a professor in the Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences Department at UCLA. I also direct the Center for Climate Science at UCLA.
Alex, how much time do we have to stop climate change?
There is always scope for slowing down climate change. We are committed to a certain amount of climate change because of decisions that have been made in the past about emissions, and the climate system is still responding to those elevated emissions levels and those elevated levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So we are stuck with a certain amount of climate change. But if we reduce our emissions over the coming few decades, especially in the next 10 years or so, if we really start in earnest in those emissions reductions efforts, we will reduce climate change greatly, and we will slow down climate change significantly. So I would say in the next 10 to 30 years, it's a really critical time for us.
In your opinion, is it hopeless to stop climate change?
It is not hopeless to stop climate change. We don't have the possibility of avoiding climate change entirely, but we definitely can slow down climate change by making decisions now or within the next 10 years to reduce emissions and to get ourselves on a pathway of a low-carbon economy or a zero-carbon economy. If we don't do anything to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and we stay on this pathway of ever-increasing emissions year after year after year, we will see a very dramatically different climate by, say, the end of the 21st century. We will see a globally averaged warming of somewhere probably between 7 and 11 degrees Fahrenheit. We will see dramatic impacts on all of the frozen water on the planet. We'll see a dramatic reduction in, say, the Arctic sea ice. We'll see a reduction in ice sheets, a dramatic increase in sea level. We will see a huge increase in heat waves. We will see big challenges in water availability globally. We will see huge impacts on ecosystems that we don't fully understand. It will really be a different world from the one that we know now if we don't do anything to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions.
Ultimately, do you think climate change is caused by humans?
We know that the climate change that we've seen in the past few decades is almost certainly the result of human activity. One way we know that is that the rate of climate change that's occurred over the past few decades far exceeds anything that we've ever seen in the geologic record. It's very unlikely that that change would result from natural processes. The other reason why we know that this change over the past few decades is due to human activity is because we don't have any way to reproduce this trend when we model the climate system, except by imposing the observed increases in greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. So when we try to model the climate system, we try to include all the processes that are important for climate. In so doing, we build a climate model. And that climate model has variability like the real climate does. And we can look at that variability. We can ask ourselves, could that variability be matched by the observed record? And it turns out that we can't match that variability unless we impose the increases in greenhouse gas emissions that we've seen over the past century on the climate model. So, science is built around theory and observations, and we try to match our theory with the observations. And the only theory of the climate system that actually works and reproduces the observed increase in globally average surface temperature is the one where we include the large increase in greenhouse gas concentrations that we have observed in the atmosphere over the past century.
Now, what are the main threats of climate change?
There are many different ways in which climate change is a threat. The increase in temperature alone is a threat to human beings, especially because it leads to a big increase in heat extremes. And we know that there's increased human mortality and morbidity when there's an extreme heat event. And with a warmer world, these extreme heat events become much more likely. The other way that climate change is a threat is through its impact on our water systems. A warmer world is associated with a very different cycling of water, and water is essential for life, including for humans. So we're changing the patterns of precipitation, especially by creating more extreme flooding, and also by increasing the likelihood of drought. Both of those things are projected to happen in many parts of the world, and the increase in flooding and the increase in drought both imply big water management challenges. And when you compound that with the fact that people in general haven't been using water very wisely in semi-arid regions especially, that really does imply huge water sustainability challenges going forward. The other risk associated with climate change is the rise in sea level, the impact on coastal communities and flooding, and big storm surges that are exacerbated by a rise in sea level would cause risks to property. Another risk associated with climate change is the impact on our ecosystems, which we actually don't fully understand. We don't have a full grasp of how a warmer world with a different cycling of water would affect natural ecosystems, but we know the effect is likely to be profound. And we have some early examples of that with the increases in megafire that we've seen in many places around the world, which are an early manifestation of the impact of warming on ecosystems. In the ocean, we also have an impact on coral reefs through oceanic heat waves that cause coral bleaching. And we also have impact on ocean ecosystems that are dominated by organisms that produce shells. As we increase greenhouse gas concentrations, we have a more acidic ocean, and that degrades the shells of these organisms, and that causes life to be harder for them. So with a warmer world, there's an impact on food production, both because crops are sensitive to temperature, and usually the impact is not positive. Usually, plants that we grow like us are sensitive to heat extremes, and when we have more heat extremes, it's harder to grow those crops. But also, much of the world's agriculture is dependent on irrigation. And that means that the challenges that climate change poses to our water supplies are going to impact agriculture through our ability to irrigate.
What are the impacts of ecosystems changing to include climate refugees, migrations of people and populations, and seawall rising?
Anytime you have a natural resource crisis, you're going to induce people to respond. And often that is through migration. And so I think we can imagine that as climate change creates more and more natural resource crises, that we would expect there to be more and more migration pressure. I think it's also worth pointing out that people are dependent on natural systems. If we just take the example of fishing, which is a lot of people rely on fish stocks to make a living and to eat. And if we challenge oceanic ecosystems in ways that we don't understand, it's not hard to imagine the collapse of oceanic ecosystems. It would also have a very direct impact on the people that rely on those systems, and that would have a huge impact on human relationships and international relations through probably, again, migration pressures. It's important to remember that all of these impacts of climate change on ecosystems that we don't fully understand are going to have knock-on effects on people and are therefore going to have security implications as well. It's very hard to speak globally about climate change impacts and not come up with descriptions that are kind of bloodless and bland. I think when you really look at specific places and you really consider the regional context, what's that place like and what are the existing resource challenges in that place, it's only then that you really discover how challenging this really is. An example of that is Florida, which is mostly just within about 3 feet of sea level. Most of the state is very flat and very, very near sea level. You also have a specific geology there. The whole state is sitting on top of limestone. So you can't build seawalls because if you have a rising sea level, the water just intrude, and you build a seawall around the place, the water will just intrude through the porous limestone and come up from underneath. So there's a unique geology and a geography in that place that makes it just incredibly vulnerable. If you go to a different place, like if you go to California, you're in an environment that is semi-arid, where you have an increased tendency towards drought. You're going to have an increased risk of wildfire. If you also combine that with the fact that there has been a century of fire suppression in California, so the vegetation is built up over a century and has not burned through natural processes, you have a very literally combustible mix of factors that are a recipe for megafire. And that creates a similar kind of existential threat to a place, a threat to all the infrastructure, a threat to the lives and property of all the people that live in that place. That's a different type of threat from the threat of sea level rise and storm surge, but it's nonetheless driven by climate change.
How is climate change impacting the ocean specifically?
The ocean is greatly impacted by a changing climate. The ocean is warming in the same way that the land is, and that leads to extreme heat waves in the ocean. Those extreme heat waves have an impact on oceanic ecosystems. The best known example is the impact on coral reefs, which are really critical components of the oceanic ecosystem. They are hosts to much of the biodiversity in the ocean. And in a warmer world with a lot more oceanic heat waves, you kill off coral much more easily. And we see examples already globally of coral die-off happening. And that is partly the result of oceanic heat waves. That causes those ecosystems to collapse. So that's one effect of a warming world on the ocean, is just the impact on oceanic heat waves. Another big impact of climate change is associated with the elevated concentrations of greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide. Because with more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you have more dissolved carbon dioxide, which leads to the production of something called carbonic acid in the ocean. The addition of carbonic acid into the ocean lowers the pH or makes the ocean more acidic, and that makes the ocean much less friendly to organisms that rely on shells for their existence. So I'm talking about clams and mollusks and sea snails, those types of organisms that have shells. And so there's a very specific impact on certain types of oceanic organisms as well. We might also mention the impact of warming on the coverage of sea ice, and the fact that in a warmer world we are already seeing a dramatic reduction in sea ice coverage, especially in the Arctic. And that is leading to dramatic changes in oceanic ecosystems in the places where sea ice is important. I'm sure you have heard of the example of the polar bears that rely on ice floes for fishing. That's going to have all kinds of unanticipated knock-on effects on the ecosystem because you're taking out an apex predator. It's these types of web effects or network effects that we can't entirely anticipate. The other, I think, point to make about the ocean is that the ocean is incredibly important for the cycling of carbon. Right now, the ocean is taking up about half of the carbon dioxide that we're putting into the atmosphere and actually providing us a real benefit because we have a much smaller increase in carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere than we would have if the ocean weren't taking up so much carbon. And if we warm the oceans and we change oceanic ecosystems, it's not clear that the ocean will continue to take up carbon in the same way that it has been. We're getting a benefit from the ocean that may not continue because we are interfering with it through a warming climate and through increased greenhouse gas concentrations.
What are projected timelines, or what are certain benchmarks for climate occurrences?
One question that is natural to ask around climate change is, what are the future tipping points? What are the thresholds that we might move beyond in the future that would cause irrevocable harm or irrevocable change in the climate system? There are a few examples of tipping points that we can point to. One is the projected disappearance of sea ice in the Arctic. It's pretty clear that if we continue to increase greenhouse gases at the rate that we have been, that Arctic sea ice will likely disappear, at least for part of the year, somewhere between 2050 and, say, 2080. And that would lead to really dramatic changes in that whole region. There would be huge impacts on oceanic ecosystems, but also there'd be big impacts on things like international trade patterns, on the ability to operate ships and submarines in the Arctic, to extract natural resources from the Arctic. There's already a lot of renewed competition internationally in the Arctic because of the projected loss of Arctic sea ice. That's an example of a change that is irreversible, at least in the foreseeable future, due to the continued emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But there are many other tipping points that we can contemplate. We actually don't know. The huge ice sheet that covers Antarctica might become unstable and actually fall into the ocean, causing a catastrophic rise in sea level. Another example of a tipping point is the state of the Amazon. As many people know, the Amazon is subject to a lot of human pressure that's independent of climate change, deforestation, human-caused fire, which is meant to clear land, and the conversion of forest to agriculture. So if you destroy the Amazon rainforest by deforesting and fires, that would also lead to aridification. So both climate change and the human pressures that we're putting on it, and you can imagine those two things working together to produce a rapid decline. There are questions around megafire and whether we have entered an era of megafire, whether certain regions that were not subject to extreme fire are going to be newly subject to megafire. These are questions that we have that we don't have great answers to.
Natural resource competition and tensions over those resources often lead to conflict. Explain why these issues should be on the forefront of every government.
In the U.S., we are certainly greatly impacted by climate change. We've seen the emergence of megafires in the western U.S. We've seen big storms and a big increase in damages from storms to life and property. But we are actually much better equipped than most places in the world to cope with these types of events. I think in most countries, they don't have the infrastructure and the knowledge to plan and adapt. Also, I think migration and immigration pressures, which affect the internal politics of the U.S. Pretty dramatically. Right now, there's a big surge in migration pressure at the southern border of the U.S. It's not hard to imagine a situation where you have multiple natural resource crises happening in different parts of the world at the same time, driven by climate change. They happen to co-occur by chance, and that drives a wave of immigration into the U.S. So that's a security threat to the U.S. We need to be thinking globally, and I would argue especially in the places that are least equipped to deal with the impacts of climate change. One way that I think climate change is emerging as a threat to many countries is that the scale of the impacts is increasing. For example, the floods in Pakistan, those had an enormous scope, covered a huge geographical area. They lasted for a long time. They were very intense. That is a scale and magnitude that has the ability to destabilize a government at the national scale. A country like India is very reliant on the monsoon. Most of its food production is reliant on a single type of weather system, which is the arrival every summer of the monsoon. If you have a warmer world where the water cycle is more volatile, more prone to both drought and flooding. I think India is an example of a country that's quite vulnerable to that type of changes in extremes.
Do you feel that local or international laws are driving decarbonization fast enough?
There is a very pessimistic story to tell about decarbonization, which is that if you look at the emissions of carbon over the past 20 years or so, they've increased pretty rapidly, and they continue to increase, even though the rate has slowed a little bit. And if you just extrapolate from that, there is going to be a very, very significant human influence on the climate by the end of the century. At the same time, there have been these amazing developments. In the past 20 years, the cost of wind and solar has gone down below the cost of most fossil fuels. It's now much more economical to do renewable energy. In addition, we've seen the U.S. take a huge step forward with the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill that was passed. The infrastructure bill includes a lot of funding for transmission lines, which are needed to connect renewable power sources to consuming areas like cities. It also includes charging stations for vehicles. The transportation sector in the U.S. is a big source of emissions. And it also, the Inflation Reduction Act includes a lot of incentives for electric vehicles. So our transportation sector in the U.S., which is a big factor in emissions, is very likely to be transformed in the coming decades by these changes. That's the first time that the U.S. at the federal level has really signaled to the world that we are serious about getting our greenhouse gas emissions under control. That, I think, is very likely to change the dynamics globally, because now people can't point to the U.S. as a laggard. And that has been the dynamic for a very long time. And so I think that there are really strong trends now towards decarbonization. In addition, I think the national security environment favors renewables because fossil fuel producers are unfriendly to the U.S. and to Europe. I'm thinking specifically of countries like Russia and now Saudi Arabia potentially. And so there is a push towards renewables because of the need to be energy independent. So I think the positive story about renewables is that their cost is a lot lower, and there are pressures like national security and changes in policy in countries like the U.S. that I think will drive pretty significant changes and will drive decarbonization much more quickly over the coming decades.
Do you think there's a healthy competition amongst countries to decarbonize?
We're entering, I think, an era now where there is still a lot of commitment to reduce emissions, but it seems to be happening in an environment of national competition. Or international competition, I should say. Individual countries are pushing in their own way for their own reasons for decarbonization.
What are some climate blind spots that scientists have missed in the past or could miss in the future?
An example of that is the emergence of megafire in places like Australia and the Western U.S. and in the Mediterranean part of Europe. We predicted warming. We predicted loss of Arctic sea ice. We predicted changes in the water cycle. We didn't predict that we would have megafires emerging in the last decade or so. And it's pretty clear that the size of these fires is sensitive to the temperature. So we know that climate change has played a role. And we don't know if there are other similar types of phenomena that might emerge. And so I think there really is potential for more blind spots in the climate system. We are messing with the ecology of the planet, and we know that the ecology of the planet is very complicated. It's going to react in complicated and unexpected ways when we change the environment in this dramatic way. And we are also exerting pressure on the natural world in many other ways. And I would expect that, as with wildfire, it's this interaction between climate change and the other human pressures where we'll see these emerging impacts that we can't entirely predict.
Will we see more countries in the private sector get into geoengineering, and what are the ramifications of that?
Geoengineering is a blanket term for interventions in the climate system that would cool the planet and counteract the effects of the increase in greenhouse gases that have been seen over the past century. An example of geoengineering is to fly a bunch of airplanes continuously in the stratosphere and inject tiny particles called aerosols into the stratosphere that reflect sunshine. The reflected sunshine cools the planet and exactly counteracts the warming effects of the increase in greenhouse gases if you plan it correctly. There is zero international law around geoengineering. So anyone can do it. You could imagine a rich person deciding that they wanted to, quote unquote, solve climate change by launching a geoengineering project. I think that the impacts of climate change are large enough now and systemic enough that it's very difficult to escape from them, even if you have a lot of resources. You're either going to have to deal with it where you live, or you're going to have to become a refugee and lose that sense of home. This is a challenge for everybody. It's not something that people can escape from if they are wealthy. I think it's something that everybody will have to cope with to a certain degree. And I think that's the opportunity to seize here in everything is that as we rethink our entire basis of our economic system, that we rethink the way we do everything and overhaul it all to make it more sustainable and to function better. So I think there are real opportunities, and I'm sure that people in the military are thinking about those opportunities. And I think as we scale up decarbonization, there's going to be a wave of innovation that will be unleashed. The way I see it is that we are definitely in a crisis when it comes to the environment. We are changing the climate dramatically, and we are also exerting huge pressure on natural systems independent of climate change. And when you combine our pressure on natural systems and the fact that we're changing the climate, this really does mean that we are subject to big risks associated with the changing environment. It's a cliche that every crisis is an opportunity, but it's true. That's the reason why it's a cliche. And I think there's an opportunity here to transform our relationship with the natural world. And that's something that no species on Earth has ever had the opportunity to do, to actually learn on a global scale how to live in equilibrium with natural resources, to not use them at a rate beyond which they can be sustainably replenished at a global scale. I have no doubt that we can do that. I think we are plenty smart enough to meet that challenge. I think if we can organize ourselves, I have no doubt that we can do that.
As long as the human race exists, there will always be conflicts to resolve. Conflicts that affect the land we live on, the food we eat, the water we drink. Until we find a way to work together, things will eventually get to the point where the odds are against us, where the war no longer looms, but is upon us. The Over the Horizon series is produced by Mohammed Mirgahari. Special thanks to Alex Hall, Adam Nielsen, Eric Lyon, and Ruth Wilhoit. Sound recording and mix by Mike Zhu. This is a Sputnik Media production.